Okay. We're going to continue on now from where we left off and halfway through Luke 6. We have read about the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the assembling of the first batch of the disciples, and the rise of opposition as the authorities don't take too kindly to Jesus doing things on his own volition and without their permission and approval. I have a cat here that I have to deal with. This cat likes to tap me on the shoulder to get my attention. You just saw her do it right there. Oh yeah, oh my. This is what I have to deal with all the time. This is what I have to deal with every day. I got 3 of them. They take turns bothering me. As soon as this one is done, one of the other 2 will come around. They literally take turns bothering me. So when this one is done, another one of the other 2 will come around and start bothering me. I never get a break, except for the couple hours each day where they're all asleep at the same time. That's it. It only happens a couple hours a day. Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 12. One of those days, so just sometime early in his ministry apparently, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. So these are different than just simple disciples. A disciple is a student. A disciple is one who is learning from a teacher. In their cultures, you could become a teacher, or a rabbi as they called it, at age 30, and you would take on disciples who would usually be young men in their mid to late teens or early 20s. That's a student, someone who's going to learn from a teacher. That's a disciple. I can't stop this. You're so annoying. Quit that. But these are separate. These are disciples, but they're also apostles. There is a separate group within that larger group of disciples called apostles. An apostle means one sent, or a sent one. So these guys are going to end up having a separate, special, unique mission to be sent out as ambassadors for Christ later on. Not all the apostles are disciples, but not all disciples are apostles. There will end up being more apostles than just these guys who are going to be listed here. We'll talk about kind of the differences in the various kinds of apostles when we get into the New Testament and we see this term applied more broadly. But basically an apostle is one sent. And you could send someone, okay, so there are different kinds of apostles based on who's doing the sending. Jesus is the apostle from God, the one sent by God. These 12 men are the apostles of Jesus, one sent by Jesus. Paul will be in that category too eventually. Then you have the apostles of the church, ones who are sent by the church. We call those missionaries today. And we'll read about those more when we get in the book of Acts and in some of Paul's letters. So right now, he has a crowd of disciples. We didn't read about how he got all of them. Some of them he got from John's initial group of disciples. We know from the Gospel of John that probably at least half of Jesus' own disciples were originally John the Baptist's disciples, and they switched over to Jesus when he got marked out and anointed as the Messiah. But we don't know where he got all the rest of them. But somehow he had a group of them, and he had a large enough group that he could choose 12 of the men from that group to be these special apostles. So here they are. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, and their brothers as well, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, that'd be Levi, the guy that we mentioned earlier, the tax collector, who's called Matthew here, and not Levi, but the same dude, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, so another James. They have 2 James in the group. That's why this guy The other James, the brother of John, is one of the top guys. The innermost circle of the apostles are Peter, James, and John. And so that James, the brother of John, is one of the top three. And so this other James is not one of the top three. So another word that we often call him, I don't know if the Bible itself ever calls him this, but history has sometimes referred to this other James as James the Less, because he is not as prominent. Now the older James, the brother of John James, he's going to die pretty early. We'll read about his death in Acts chapter 12. So he won't end up accomplishing much in the long term because he's not going to live long enough to do so. But while the ministry was still ongoing, he is one of the top three. So this other James is often called James the Less because he's not the top James. Anyway, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became, this Judas, son of James, is also referred to as Thaddeus in some of the other Gospels. They would have had like multiple names or multiple ways of pronouncing their names. That's one of the reasons why it makes it kind of tricky. But this Judas, son of James, is called Thaddeus in some of the other accounts. And Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And that may be to set him apart from Judas Iscariot. Because those are two guys named Judas. Now, Judas itself is a version of the name Judah, okay, which is what the entire country was named after. And Judah was the fourth son of Jacob. He ends up being the preeminent son who gets the right of having the king come from his line. So David is of the tribe of Judah. Jesus, of course, is from the tribe of Judah. So that ends up becoming the kingly line. And when the kingdom splits, the northern kingdom, the tribes that make up the northern kingdom are just called Israel. They inherit the name Israel, and the southern kingdom is just called Judah because the dominant tribe in the southern kingdom is Judah. And in fact, that's where the word Jew comes from. A Jew is a Judahite who returned to the land after the exile. So there was nothing. Nowadays, Judas is a stigma like that. That name nowadays, with the S at the end in English, Judas, is stigmatized because of Judas Iscariot. And it may have even started being that way, at least in Christian circles already, because in other lists of the apostles' names, this guy Judas, son of James, is called Thaddeus, possibly to distinguish him from Judas Iscariot. Anyway, so Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. He, Jesus, went down with them and stood on a level place, so a plain, in other words. A large crowd of his disciples was there. So he had a large crowd. By this point, whether they all came from John the Baptist or they started going around with Jesus as he began his ministry, we read in John that he actually started his ministry farther south in Judea and Samaria, and then went back up to Galilee after Herod was imprisoned, or after Herod imprisoned John. Then he went back up to Galilee and began his ministry there. So these people have had some exposure to him. He's done some preaching in the villages and towns already. So he has a crowd, a large enough crowd that he can pick 12 men out of that crowd to be his apostles. So a large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coast of Tyre and Sidon. Now, these people are not necessarily his disciples. They may be seekers, they may be curious, but they're distinguished from his disciples. He has a large crowd of his disciples, out of whom he picked 12 apostles. And there's another great number of people there from all over the place who are not necessarily his disciples. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. So they're interested and curious. They may just want to get well, but they're not his disciples, at least not yet. Maybe some of them became his disciples, but some of them, they're not that yet. Those troubled by evil spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him, because power was coming from him and healing them all. Looking at his disciples, he said, so now we're going to get to some preaching of Jesus. The rest of chapter 6 now is going to be a selection of Jesus' preaching. This is all going to have an equivalent in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. And when I read the Sermon on the Mount, when I did through the Gospel of Matthew, I made sure to point out the times when in one corrupted Hebrew manuscript of the Gospel, we have a line inserted there saying, again, Jesus said to his disciples. And I did that to show that every time you see that in that version of Matthew, there's a break in Luke where Luke goes to another portion of his account. Luke does not record the entire Sermon on the Mount in one place like Matthew did. And he breaks it up into chunks, and these chunks, amazingly enough, correspond to chunks that we see in an existing, although somewhat corrupted, Hebrew version of Matthew, indicating to me that there was originally an account of Jesus' teaching that ended up in Matthew in the form that we have it today, but did not start out that way. This is where people get the idea, because as we said, we read the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Mark talks about Jesus being a teacher, but doesn't include very many examples of his teaching. Matthew does, and he arranges his book around the teaching and then inserts the narrative of the events in between the blocks of teaching to connect the blocks of teaching. It appears as though Luke patterned his organization of the events of Jesus' life after Mark's, but also included teaching that we end up finding in the Gospel of Matthew. However, he does not arrange it the same way that Matthew arranges it. I speculate that this is because Luke is drawing from an earlier tradition of oral or possibly even written teaching that eventually ended up incorporated into Matthew and quite possibly came from Matthew to begin with, but was originally not in the form that we have it in the Gospel of Matthew and was compiled into that form by Matthew at a later point in time. But that is what Luke is relying on as he incorporates these sections of Jesus' teaching, which have a lot of overlap with the teaching sections in Matthew, but they're not arranged the same way. I believe Luke is drawing from the same source that ends up becoming Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew as we know it, but that material is not arranged in the same way, and so Luke is putting it in different places throughout his Gospel. This is what makes it difficult for me, honestly, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not really all that fond of the Gospel of Luke, because I prefer the way Matthew arranges this teaching material. Luke has it all chopped up and scattered in different places, and sometimes it can be very difficult to determine what he had in mind when he arranged it the way he did. Like with Matthew, the arrangement style is very, very reminiscent of Old Testament teaching. And of course, if you spend years studying the Old Testament, which we did, and we read through the Old Testament, and you go right into Matthew, like it's a completely natural transition. Like it's arranged very similarly to the 5 books of Moses and other teaching blocks, the prophet books of the Old Testament. Luke is not. Luke is arranged kind of piecemeal, scattered in it. There are times when I have a really difficult time figuring out like why Luke put some information where he did. And that is one of the things I dislike about the Gospel of Luke. It is harder for me to follow the flow of the way he presents Jesus' teaching, because he doesn't do it nearly as elegantly, in my view, as Matthew does. But I think it's because he's drawing from an earlier version of what would become the written Gospel of Matthew, where this stuff wasn't arranged as carefully as it is now in the Gospel of Matthew, and was originally just a block of written teachings. And Luke is taking them block for block and just kind of putting them wherever it makes sense in his narrative. But like I said, I have a hard time determining how he decided what to put where. So anyway, Jesus is now going to begin what we call the Sermon on the Plain, which is basically the same thing as the Sermon on the Mount. He probably gave one of the things we can take away from this is that Jesus would have given very similar sermons repeatedly. Okay, if you go to a single church long enough, and I'm 43 years old, I went to Zion for 20 years, I'm 21 years, I've now got 22 years, I've now gone to GAC, Greater Alton Church, for 21 years. Now at Zion we had different pastors who would come. We had one guy who was there all the time I was there, and we had different associate pastors who would come and go every few years, and they had different speaking styles and different interests. At GAC, it's been the same people ever since I've been there. And if you stay there long enough, you're going to hear the same sermon preached multiple times. Okay, there are some topics, some sermons that I've heard, both at Zion and at GAC. They're like, I've heard this sermon before. Okay, you might as well just play a tape or a CD of a previous sermon, because it's the same guy basically speaking about the same subject and hitting many of the same points that he has hit 5 or 6 times in the past. Jesus undoubtedly did the same, and because he went to different places, and he would have given the very similar sermons and told very similar parables in different settings. So it's really more of a compilation of different kinds of sermons, different sermons he would give at different times. But because this would have been the thrust of his message all throughout his ministry.